Mill showed up to my baby shower in a white dress. She said, I wanted to look good for the photos. I had the waiters serve her red wine all night. She left in a stained mess. The day I met my mother-in-law, Cressida, I knew I was in for something unique. I'm Lillian, just Lily to everyone but my mom when she's mad, and I come from a quiet little town outside Rochester, New York. I grew up in a house with a perpetually creaky staircase, the kind of place where you could always hear someone moving around. Maybe that's why I always wanted family close. Alaric and I had been together since college, and though we didn't always see eye to eye, we saw something in each other that kept us coming back, and that mattered. Our relationship was simple, steady, and rooted in real things. His mother, though? Cressida? She was anything but. I hadn't even hit the driveway the first time I visited their house before I saw her, waving grandly from the front porch like a queen on a balcony. Darling. She called out, and I could practically hear her drawing out the vowels. Welcome, welcome. You must be Lillian. It wasn't like she could have been talking to anyone else. But I just smiled and let her envelop me in an unexpectedly strong hug. Up close, I could see she was decked out in a full-length dress, pearls, and even a little fascinator hat. For a casual dinner. She looked like a character from a noir film, which would have been fine, I guess, if she wasn't also looking at me with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for an unwanted houseguest. Such an interesting style you have, she murmured, brushing her fingers against the hem of my jacket. So relaxed. Thank you? I laughed, glancing at Alaric, who was fidgeting by the door, clearly uncomfortable. He gave me a helpless smile. Come in, Cressida said, waving her hand with a dramatic flourish. It's my absolute joy to host my darling boy and his guest. That's how it started, and that's how it stayed, with Cressida inserting herself into every part of our lives. We'd been married 3 years when we finally got the news that I was pregnant, after a year of trying. Alaric was ecstatic, practically bouncing around the house with excitement. I thought the news would help Cressida warm up to me, maybe even see me as part of the family. After all, this was her grandchild. But instead, it seemed to heighten her intensity. One night, a few weeks after we told her the news, she called. Alaric was out, so it was just the two of us on the line. Lillian, darling, she said, her voice sugary and high-pitched, like she was forcing sweetness through a mouthful of lemon. I've been thinking. It's just such an important event, bringing a child into the world. I'd love to be involved in some way. Of course, I replied, genuinely pleased. We were planning a baby shower, and you're more than welcome to help with the preparations. Oh, help? She let out a laugh that was both shrill and condescending. No, dear, I'm sure you don't have experience with these things yet, but I planned my own baby shower, and threw my own parties back in the day. I think it's best I just take over, as it were. Make sure things go smoothly. I'm sure you don't want to get bogged down in all that stress. I gritted my teeth. I already have things in mind, actually. I want it to be simple and just feel like a celebration of family. We're thinking of having it at a vineyard, something relaxed. Cressida sniffed, a sound I could practically see as she lifted her chin in disdain. Relaxed, she said it as if it were a dirty word. Well, I suppose that's fine. But I'll still bring my own touches. You'll thank me later, darling, when you see how marvelous everything turns out. I wasn't about to argue, so I just mumbled an okay and left it at that, hoping her touches would be as small as she promised. The day of the shower arrived, and despite my nerves about Cressida, I was excited. We'd picked a charming vineyard just outside Ithaca, with a cozy barn strung with fairy lights and tables decorated with wildflowers and soft linens. It was everything I'd wanted, something magical but unpretentious. As the guests started to arrive, I began to feel the thrill of anticipation. I stood there, surrounded by people I loved, holding Alaric's hand, glowing with the thought of our soon-to-arrive baby. Then, I saw her. She entered the barn like she was stepping onto a red carpet, pausing just inside the door with her chin tilted up and a slight smirk on her lips. She was dressed in a long, flowing white gown with lace sleeves, a sweetheart neckline, and a full skirt that billowed around her as she walked. It was the kind of dress a bride might wear for a vintage-inspired wedding. But it was my baby shower, and she looked like she was there to renew her vows or something. People turned to look. I could see my friends and family exchanging glances, some of them covering their mouths in shock. I felt a chill run down my spine. Cressida? I said, my voice wavering. I tried to sound polite, but I could feel my hand squeezing Alaric's in desperation. You look very dressed up. She gave a girlish little giggle, fluttering her lashes. Oh, I know. I wanted to look good for the photos. She tilted her head, casting a mischievous smile over her shoulder at one of my aunts who was snapping pictures. After all, darling, these photos are going to last a lifetime. Alaric took a small step forward, his mouth opening to say something, but I gave him a quick shake of the head. I didn't want to make a scene. I'd deal with her antics, just like I always did. So, I pasted on a tight-lipped smile and tried to ignore the growing pit of dread in my stomach. But Cressida wasn't content with just dressing like a bride. Oh, no. Every few minutes, she'd find a new excuse to swoop into the center of the room, greeting guests like she was the host and insisting on taking photos with me and Alaric, and often just Alaric. By the time the cake came out, she'd managed to commandeer nearly every conversation, regaling my friends and family with stories about her glamorous days and her unique sense of style. At one point, I overheard her telling my best friend Carla, "You know, when I was pregnant with Alaric, I wore designer gowns, attended galas. Being a mother doesn't mean you have to give up style." She shot a glance at me, her gaze flicking over my simple floral dress with thinly veiled contempt. Carla raised her eyebrows, giving me a look of sympathy, but Cressida kept going. "Of course, dear Lillian has her own rustic taste," she said the word rustic with a slight shudder. "But that's okay. Not everyone is born with a sense of elegance." I was gripping my fork so hard it nearly bent. But I told myself to let it go. This was my day, not hers. Or so I thought. Later, as I was unwrapping gifts, Cressida sauntered up with a box in her hands. She'd wrapped it in gleaming white paper, tied with a giant silver bow. She held it out, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. "For my future grandbaby," she cooed, placing it in front of me with a dramatic flourish. "Something from Alaric's own infancy." I opened it carefully, already bracing myself. Inside was a worn baby blanket, yellowed with age and dotted with mysterious stains that made my stomach turn. I held it up by the corner, and a faint, musty smell wafted out. "Alaric used to sleep with this every night," Cressida said, clasping her hands and tilting her head with a dreamy look. "It was his favorite. I thought it would be so special to pass it on. Imagine, our little one wrapped in his daddy's memories." My cheeks burned, but I forced a smile and mumbled a polite, "Thank you." Cressida beamed, satisfied, while I tried not to gag. The day dragged on, with Cressida soaking up attention at every turn. But as the evening crept in, and people were starting to relax with glasses of wine, I noticed something. Cressida was only drinking white wine, insisting that red is so low class and white wine keeps me looking fresh. I watched her, an idea sparking in my mind. I'm not normally a vengeful person. Really, I'm not. But as I watched Cressida float around the party in her blindingly white dress, flouncing and fussing, inserting herself into every conversation, every photo, I could feel my patience snapping, thread by thread. By the time she sniffed about the low-class red wine, I was done. I wanted her out of my baby shower, and if I couldn't get her out, I could at least make sure she wouldn't feel quite so comfortable here. Alaric caught me watching her with a look he knew too well. He leaned over and whispered, "Lily, don't do anything you'll regret." I turned to him, squeezing his hand with a smile that must have looked serene, but held a storm behind it. "I promise I won't regret this at all." There was a server making rounds with a tray of drinks, mostly red wine. I caught his attention and slipped a 50 into his hand, whispering in his ear. He grinned, nodded, and went back to the kitchen, only to return a minute later with a fresh glass of red, heading straight for Cressida. I watched as he offered it to her. She took it, grimaced, then handed it back. "Oh, I don't drink red, dear. It stains terribly, and I couldn't possibly risk ruining my dress." The server, unfazed, offered her another glass a few minutes later. She refused again, frowning, but I saw her resolve beginning to crack. She clearly wanted another drink, and red was all that was available. The next time he circled back, she accepted it, sipping carefully. I held back a smirk, pretending to be deep in conversation with Carla, who was watching me with a curious eyebrow raised. "Lily, what are you doing?" she whispered, glancing toward Cressida. "Oh, just a little harmless revenge," I replied, eyes gleaming. "Think of it as justice for that wedding dress stunt she's pulling." Carla's eyes widened, then she bit her lip to suppress a laugh. "I'm here for it." From that point on, the server made sure to keep Cressida's glass full of red wine. She tried to nurse each glass, but after a while, I could tell it was getting to her. Her cheeks were flushed, and her gestures were a little grander, her laugh a little too loud. And then it happened. She was standing next to the cake table, gesturing wildly as she told some exaggerated story about her days as a high society debutante, a story I'd heard 3 times that night already. In her enthusiasm, she tipped her glass, splashing red wine down the front of her pristine white gown. There was a collective gasp from the guests around her as a deep, red stain spread across her dress, bleeding into the delicate lace. "Oh! Oh my God!" she shrieked, looking down in horror. The server appeared at her side, napkins in hand, but it was no use. The wine had soaked in, leaving a large, unmistakable stain right over her chest and stomach. Cressida looked like she'd been run over by a truck carrying barrels of Merlot. She dabbed frantically at the dress, only managing to smear the stain further, spreading the red into the delicate lace sleeves and down the bodice. Her face was a mixture of horror and rage, and for once, she seemed completely out of words. "Oh, Cressida," I said, feigning concern and moving closer. Are you all right? She looked up, her eyes blazing. Who on earth thought it was a good idea to serve only red wine? Do you realize how hard this is going to be to clean? I shrugged, keeping my face as innocent as possible. It's a vineyard. Red wine is kind of their specialty. Besides, you did say you wanted to look good for the photos. Her mouth opened and closed, her face a mask of fury. This dress is ruined. It's just a dress, Cressida, I said with a sympathetic pat on her arm. After all, the day is about family, isn't it? Not about what we're wearing. I couldn't resist adding, maybe next time you'll think twice about wearing white to someone else's event. It's a bit impractical, don't you think? The color drained from her face, and she glared at me with a look that could have melted steel. But she had no words left. She knew she'd been caught, and even her usual theatrics couldn't save her. She huffed, grabbed her purse, and stomped out of the barn, leaving a trail of red-smeared napkins in her wake. As the door closed behind her, a wave of laughter rippled through the room. Carla gave me a high five, and Alaric, my dear, loyal husband, just shook his head, chuckling. She deserved that, he said quietly, wrapping his arm around me. Thank you for keeping your promise. And for making sure I didn't have to say a word. I smiled up at him, feeling a warm satisfaction settle over me. I'd stood up for myself, in my own way. And I knew that, for once, Cressida had finally met her match.